Hello everyone, many of you asked me to do videos on Iran, so I thought, what would be the best way but to start with the economy of Iran during the monarchy and what were the effects. So let's embark on a journey into Iran's past under the reign of the second Pahlavi's monarch, an era that unfolded as a paradox of fast-paced economic progression contrasted with a stubborn political stagnation. We'll focus on the period beginning in 1950s when oil revenue surged, transforming Iran's economic landscape. Oil is often considered both a blessing and a curse, a concept referred to as the resource curse. To the best of my knowledge, Norway is only, or at least one of the rare countries that kinda avoided the resource curse. Everyone else felt paradoxical effects of it. The adverse effects of the overdependence on a single resource, in this case oil, radiated throughout Iran's economy and society. As the nation's coffers swelled with oil money, the economy became heavily reliant on this single commodity, to the detriment of sectors such as agriculture. This dependence fueled rural exodus, uncontrolled urban expansion, and mismatch between economic requirements and the available resources, skills, and opportunities. More critically, the resource curse resulted in stagnation or even reversal in the evolution from rentier economies, further consolidating the existing institutions and structures. The monarchy, already wielding control over the vast oil-generated revenues, further consolidated its power. The oil revenue that stood at a meager 34 million in 1953 skyrocketed to nearly 5 billion by 1973, further escalating to 20 billion by 1977. This financial muscle allowed the monarch to manipulate resources, thereby nullifying any potential political leverage that other institutions might have acquired. This had a profound impact on the social classes as well, enforcing political compliancy. Many in the middle class found themselves as salaried government employees, realizing that loyalty was the surest path to career advancement. Others in the private sector chased after business prospects, while some in the bazaar maintained a level of autonomy from the state, later forming ties with the clergy. Meanwhile, the wealthy elite found it profitable to invest in industry, although their numbers were insufficient to form a substantial class. Even those who existed were reliant on political connections and patronage to secure necessary resources for their businesses. Oil thus played a dual role, fostering economic growth while inhibiting political evolution. On the other hand, it triggered significant improvements in living standard and wealth distribution, although unevenly. It enabled the state to invest in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, promoting the middle class, increasing purchasing power, and modernizing the economy. Illustratively, literacy rates shot up from 15% in 1956 to 47.5% in 1976, with female literacy experiencing a similar leap from 8% to 35.5% in the same period. School enrollments expanded, with the number of students doubling from 3.6 million in 1968 to 6.8 million in 1978, and the number of girls in schools more than doubling from 1.2 million to 2.5 million. Concurrently, the workforce experienced a shift from agriculture to scientific, technical, and artistic fields. Yet, on the other hand, oil revenue perpetuated the absolute monarchy longer than perhaps its natural lifespan, preventing the formation of a strong industrialist class and curbing the independence of the newly emerging modern middle class. However, it left the traditional middle class, particularly those in the private sector, largely untouched. This group, centered around the traditional bazaar economy, formed strong ties with another traditional group, the clergy, based on shared cultural and religious values. When these bazaari merchants and the clergy harnessed the mobilization potential of rural migrants and the ideological power of discontented intellectuals, they constituted a force that even the absolute monarch struggled to quell. Without any robust political institutions, the monarchy was highly susceptible to any signs of instability, and such signs were indeed plentiful. This ultimately culminated in a revolution. Now let's dive into the rapid growth that the economy of the country experienced during the Pahlavi era, focusing more on the reign of Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. This period saw significant economic growth, notably post-1950s, when oil revenues started pouring into state coffers at an unparalleled scale. Looking at the period from 1941 to 1961, we observe a lack of considerable industrial growth. There were only a handful of major industries sprouting across the country, with investments primarily directed towards small and medium-sized businesses. It wasn't until 1962 that we begin to see the rise of large-scale industrial complexes, such as steel mills, grain dams, and cement factories. It's important to note that the majority of these large ventures were state-owned and operated, although there were a few privately owned enterprises as well. Unfortunately, the subsequent revolution led to the destruction of much of this private sector and the nationalization of its assets. Throughout this era, both Pahlavis perceived the state as the principal driver of the economic development. This resulted in the establishment of the expansive state in terms of size and scope. This growth was particularly conspicuous in the armed forces and state bureaucracy. Let's consider some figures. By 1941, the army had expanded 6 times, equating to 120 men in uniform, supported by a humble air force, navy, and a formidable military intelligence. In parallel, the bureaucracy expanded to encompass 90,000 civil servants across 13 ministries. Fast forward to the end of Second Pahlavi's monarch's reign in 1978 to 79, we see that the military now comprised of 410,000 men in uniform, 100,000 Air Force personnel, and another 25,000 in the Navy. Remarkably, the military's budget grew 34 times between 1945 and 1972, while the national budget increased 24 times. Bureaucracy had also ballooned to encompass 300,000 civil servants spread across 21 ministries. The growth in education was remarkable too, with 28,600 schools and a student population of nearly 5 million, and the higher education sector seeing over 1.5 million students across 13 universities. Let's now discuss the role of oil in this scenario. Commercial exploitation of oil began in the early 1900s. However, until 1950s, the influence of oil revenues on the economy was minimal. This was due to the fact that most of the state finances during this period were derived from non-oil resources. Although the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company saw a steady increase in annual profits, its contribution to the Iranian economy were minimal. The nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company during the Mossadegh's prime ministership saw a considerable reduction in oil revenues, as the country faced major disruptions in petroleum production and sales. Things took a turn after the 1953 coup, with the consortium agreement enabling a new revenue stream for the government. As an example, between 1954 and 1969, Iran received an estimated $6.3 billion in payments from the sales of its oil, enabling substantial increase in government expenditures with minimal need for taxation. Despite these efforts, the monarchy was fostering an authoritarian bureaucratic developmental state. However, starting from the 1960s, a clear developmental strategy emerged, centering around three pillars: promoting rapid economic growth, implementing concurrent and reinforcing social reforms, and instituting price controls to curb inflation. As oil revenues started to flood in and the state strived to systemize developmental planning, the government conceived various ambitious plans. These were funded by oil revenues and implemented via 5-year developmental plans. The government initiated these developmental plans in 1949 to streamline economic development. However, in the initial stages, there was a disconnect between the plan's promises and their actual fulfillment. For instance, only 20% of the first development plan was accomplished. Factors such as coinciding drought and declining oil revenues made the second development plan mostly unsuccessful as well. Despite these setbacks, the subsequent 5-year plans enjoyed relatively better success in achieving their targets. The first development plan coincided with the oil nationalization period, resulting in significant disruptions in oil revenues. Despite this, the state commenced construction of irrigation and hydroelectric dams, tunnels, paved roads, and expanded the agricultural cultivation area. The second development plan continued with this trend, although 25% of the plan was allocated to finishing projects left over from the first plan. The third development plan prioritized communication and transportation, followed by agriculture and then mining and industry. This era also saw the establishment of the industrial cities, offering subsidized and affordable facilities for small and medium-sized enterprises. This led to the creation of the industrial cities in Ahvaz, Qazvin, Kermanshah, Saveh, and Rasht. While the results of the third development plan were mixed, an important achievement was the 1966 agreement with the Soviet Union for the construction of a steel mill. This acquisition of heavy industries was part of the strategic relationship with the Eastern Bloc. Industries like steel, tractors, and clothing stemmed from relations with the Soviet Union, while cars, cement making, tiles, and ceramics and household goods were primarily imported from Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. The fourth development plan continued to focus on heavy industrialization, with additional emphasis on water resource development, power supply expansion, domestic utilization of natural gas, rural rehabilitation, urban development, and boosting domestic food production to reduce reliance on imports. As part of this plan, the country's aviation infrastructure was also improved, with expansion at 11 airports and the construction of 6 new ones. In addition, numerous large and small dams were constructed, and significant new areas of land were put into agricultural use. The period of the fifth development plan, from 1973 to 1977, coincided with a significant oil boom, which saw prices quadruple. This led to a rapid upward revision of the plan against expert advice, with a significant increase in government spending on infrastructure and bureaucracy, both military and civilian. This was also a substantial increase in arms purchases from United States. However, by 1976, the oil boom had become a bust. Yet in many areas, particularly in the military, government expenditures remained high. In the 1970s, the plan and budget organizations developed 3 separate plans to guide the country towards the Shah's vision of the great civilization. The key document was the 1976 White Paper, the 20-year perspective, 1972 to 1992, which acknowledged the contradictions in the country's development process. The document recommended creating a strategic reserve from the surplus oil revenues to develop non-oil sectors and suggested a campaign to improve education and discipline. In support of these long-term goals, a national spatial strategy plan was drafted, outlining a 20-year development pathway that aimed to reduce dependence on oil, protect natural resources, reduce social and economic disparities, control rural to urban migration, and improve urban planning. The 6th development plan, due to start in 1978, anticipated a decline in oil resource by late 1980s and recognized the need for alternative revenue sources. It aimed for balanced growth, better absorption of revenues across the economic sectors, and prioritized investment in health, education, housing, social welfare, and culture and arts. However, this plan was never implemented due to the revolution, and underlying structural issues in the economy remained. Economic problems were often masked by inaccurate or inflated statistics. Data often manipulated to portray a more positive economic situation, hiding less favorable trends. This included figures on gross national product, the health of the agriculture and oil sectors, and employment rates. Even the population growth rate was inaccurately reported. This practice of data manipulation was symptomatic of larger issues in the state's administrative system, including insufficient expertise among the civil service, nepotism, favorism, and corruption. The Shah's personal involvement, often lacking in-depth understanding, was another issue. He ignored expert advice for focused growth and infrastructure expansion, choosing instead to embark on major city construction projects and attract foreign investments. This resulted in material shortages, construction delays, cost overruns, and uncontrolled rural-urban migration. In the mid-1970s, an influx of oil revenues led to a significant government spending and rising prices, particularly in residential rents, food prices, and land values. Instead of addressing the root causes of these price hikes, the state blamed merchants and shop owners. A dramatic rise in housing prices led to increasing numbers of urban families living in cramped conditions and a significant percentage of Tehran's population lacking proper housing. Despite these issues, the economy's growth gave the appearance of prosperity, concealing structural problems. One such problem was the difference between the appearance of development and meaningful economic change. The difference between the ability to manufacture goods versus merely purchasing them. The state failed to foster a shift from mercantilism to private industrial manufacturing, which hindered genuine industrial development. Cultural norms also remained hostile to industrial investment, leading to the accumulation of private wealth rather than its investment into the economy. In sum, while there were ambitious development plans in the 1960s and 1970s, there were also fundamental structural issues. These ranged from problems with economic data and the Shah's uninformed decisions to deeper the issues around the structure of the economy and the distinction between mere form and true substance of economic development. Despite efforts to modernize, these challenges impeded meaningful industrial development and perpetuated traditional forms of wealth accumulation, thereby hindering sustainable growth. I hope you like this video on the economy of the Iran during the monarchy era. What are your thoughts on this? Is there something to add, or is there something that you disagree with? Let me know down in comments. Also, a shout out to our patrons who help us produce our videos. If you are a patron, you have exclusive access to the Monarchy Report in 10 republics. And if you're not, join us and support our production. Thanks for joining. See you in the next one.